Thank you again, Val, for the invitation, and to OCAL for the opportunity to share some information about our unique partnered approach to research on workplace bullying and mistreatment. Today, I'm going to review a large-scale study conducted in Manitoba, and with that, some results, particularly looking at workplace bullying, mental health, and the role of policy awareness and training. And I'll also talk a bit about the partnership approach itself, because it is kind of unusual. A quick word on my background. I've got a master's degree in industrial organizational psychology and a PhD in organizational behavior. I've been researching what employees regard as unfair, unjust, and how they and organizations respond for about 20 years. In terms of the results for today and today's focus, we know that even though we've got growing evidence that workplace bullying impairs mental and physical health, few studies have actually examined empirically the role of policy awareness and training. And our evidence suggests that the awareness of policy and having received training, in fact, play a protective or buffering role on mental health across different kinds of exposures to bullying. And so this in turn suggests that raising awareness about those key policies and providing training are key levers for improving and preventing the erosion of decrements to health, to quality of life and work functioning for those employees who are exposed to workplace bullying. And I will note that the results I'm speaking to today and our research practice partnership reflect contributions from many, many team members, both researchers and organizational representatives, whose names and affiliations are provided on our partnership website, which is listed on the final slide for those who may want to take a look at that. So we'll just scoot over here. And in terms of the approach, I'm going to talk just a little bit to clarify the terms and briefly outline, I think, what we all know about the serious impact of bullying on individuals and organizations. I'll talk a little bit about the partnered approach that we used, which to our knowledge, which has been also confirmed by leading European scholars in this area, has not been used in North America or Europe to date. And I'll finish with some general recommendations for prevention from our research and from other past research, and next steps with time, I hope, for a few questions at the end. I want to be clear, though, that our studies are not direct interventions or evaluations of prevention initiatives. So although they are descriptive, the collection of studies are multi-wave, and they do reveal important and somewhat unexpected implications for prevention that need further study. Okay, and I'm going to go over this very quickly. I think, again, we probably most of us are aware of this, that we use in our everyday contexts and our research context a whole variety of labels and terms, just some of them are listed here, to capture interpersonal behaviors and work practices that are essentially perceived as hostile, offensive, typically unreasonable, undermining, and harmful to our mental or physical health. In our research that I'm talking about, we use the standard research definition of workplace bullying behaviors and practices, essentially those that are repeated, typically over a prolonged period, often with escalating intensity and frequency, so that targets feel they can't easily escape the situation or stop that unwanted treatment. And a quick word on prevalence as well. A common practice in research is to provide a definition of workplace bullying as something along the lines of persistent interpersonal aggression and mistreatment, and ask participants if, according to this definition, they believe that they've been bullied over a certain period of time, usually a 6-month period typically. And so using the self-identification method, estimates vary, not surprisingly. Globally, they're around 11%. In Europe, they tend to differentiate between severe and less severe. They generally report estimates around 3 to 4% in the severe category, 10 to 15% in the less severe. And lastly, in North America, our estimates, again, using the self-identification method, range between about 20 and 30%. And just to ensure we were really clear, then we know that the kind of common behaviors and work practices like yelling, threatening, or denigrating employees in public and or in private also span, though, these work practices that are unreasonable, sometimes embedded in workplace cultures themselves, and that reinforce bullying and mistreatment. The recent waves of employee suicides at France Telecom, for example, stem in large part from what an official report called a climate of management harassment and what they also call pathogenic restructuring that resulted in about 35 suicides between 2008 and 2011. And again, just a grim reminder that work practices and work conditions can themselves be perceived as bullying with very, very severe effects. We know too that when these behaviors and practices are kind of ignored or left to escalate, they can become embedded in a culture. They can become institutionalized, as scholars from Australia, Law Dollard and folks down there have been writing about. So although behaviors like incivility, which is generally regarded as rude or disrespectful behavior that demonstrates disregard for others, kind of seen as a lower level intensity or lower level intensity interpersonal conflicts, may in and of themselves seem relatively harmless. Research has shown that they can spiral and cascade to escalating severity, sometimes into direct physical extreme violence in some cases. So then just moving quickly on to the impact of bullying, we know from many, many studies that it's a costly problem for organizations and for individuals financially, emotionally, psychologically. Nielsen and Einerson's 2012 meta-analysis of 66 studies affirmed that these negative outcomes that you see here, impairments, both organizational impairments to functioning as well as individual impairments, they can be temporary, but they are also often long-lasting. There are recent estimates, for example, from Workplace Bullying Institute at the US, suggesting that a Fortune 500 company could lose $24 million per year from one bully due to lost productivity and turnover, with an added $1.4 million in costs for litigation and settlement. For the individual, which is what we're really focused on here, we know that there are a range of psychological and physical ailments related to anxiety, depression. Often targets can't stop thinking or talking about the situation. Some experience PTSD-like symptoms or actual PTSD. And for some people, the situations can feel so hopeless and people can feel so helpless that they simply can't go on. And longitudinal research coming out of Europe is showing very clearly that being bullied at work can lead to thinking about suicide. And we know that suicidal ideation is the key precursor to suicide itself. And that builds on the work by Lehman, earlier work, suggesting that 1 in 8 adult suicides is related to workplace bullying. Canada has its own growing case evidence of suicides related to workplace bullying. 2 publicized cases, one in 2017 was Saskatchewan WCB and the death of Robert Duhaime, and in PEI with the WBC involvement there in the 2013 suicide of Eric Donovan. So this backdrop and clearly the need for further research, I started thinking about and building on my own research that's been going on for a number of years that looks at employee silence for one, that those who feel that they have been mistreated choose not, for various reasons, to avail themselves of resources for remedy or redress. We identified that in Canada, we really don't have a lot of large-scale evidence of the scope and impact of the problem, and this then limits our potential for making evidence-based insights for our policy practices and decisions. And so also, if we have larger data sets, we can understand then the issues better within diverse workforces. We know that there's evidence coming from the UK, for example, that employees with disabilities or chronic health problems, younger employees, lesbian, gay, bisexual employees are more likely than other employees to experience ill treatment at work. But my own research, also looking at employee silence, suggests that those who are often most at risk are also least able to seek help from those policies and advisors and resources that are available to them. So a couple of years ago, I received a SHRC grant to build research practice collaborations with knowledge users for relevant findings that can be applied in those organizations for intervention and prevention. We were very fortunate to have a research team of Canadians, UK and European leading lights in the field, and 3 provincial organizations in Manitoba from the public sector across government, healthcare, and education, representing both the employer and employees. And these organizations share a genuine commitment to improving employees' work lives and providing safe workplaces, psychologically and physically safe workplaces, as Canadian regulatory provisions increasingly require. And I've got the Manitoba Teachers Society there highlighted in red because they're kindly providing the data that I'll be speaking to now. The partnership approach, again, just a slightly more detailed note, is that it really does, if those are of you who know about integrated knowledge translation research, for example, in the health field, this kind of partnership approach is highly labor intensive, highly time intensive for all parties. And each one brings unique assets, resources, expertise to the table for mutual benefit. And that mutual benefit includes things like very real world problems. We were looking at people's actual experiences. We're looking at organizations' actual responses. We found that it yields a benefit, as we expected, to building capacity for both academic personnel as well as the organizational representatives who are involved. We're adding to that evidence base, as I mentioned, about policy practice support. And we are contributing to knowledge building through conferences and through publications on this. We kicked off in 2015 in a kind of reverse approach to what I typically do, and this was suggested by one of our research members, is, hey, instead of doing dissemination at the very end, which is what we typically do, why don't we do this at the beginning and take advantage of these European scholars and experts who we have? So we kicked off with a symposium in which we brought over from Europe some of these key individuals. And again, our website gives more information on this if you wanted to learn more about what we did. And we invited about 100 people from the public sector and private sector in Winnipeg and a little bit beyond Winnipeg to come and listen to what the latest news was from Europe on what they're doing. And people found this very valuable. It was very well received. Our typical approach in this partnership has been to do multi-wave province-wide data gathering that is using multi-method data. So we're using primarily online surveys. In one situation, we did also supplement that with paper and pencil. And we're also combining that with focus group interview studies of bullying targets. And to our knowledge, it's the first time a focus group interview approach has been used for this purpose. We weren't really sure how that was going to work, but we found it was actually very effective to get into a little bit more detail, clearly for what participants were willing to share about their thoughts, about their sense making, and about the impact of these experiences for them. And then we synthesize this information and make it available for the organization. And we're in process now of putting that together for academic applications as well. Typically, the survey it's not a short survey, let's say it that way. We cover job information demographics, we look at workplace attitudes and perceptions, we look at experiences that include positive as well as negative, and that includes the bullying. And then we often gather equity-related information, policy awareness and training experiences, and some of our mental health. All through this, and in the design, we're of course mindful about the potential for priming effects. We work closely and carefully with organizational advisory committees to ensure that what we ask and how we ask it is relevant to that workplace. And we work very closely to ensure that we are not inadvertently revealing participant identities, whether through drilling down into various combinations of demographics or location data, that we aren't inadvertently revealing anyone's identity. We have a now kind of tried and true approach to streamline survey content so that questions that aren't relevant for people are skipped over, so it makes the experience much less onerous than it would be for the participants. That said, on average, it's about 25 minutes to complete, but there's a lot of variation. It could be as short as 5 to 7 minutes if people say they've not had any bullying exposure. And it also could be longer than 25 if people choose to elaborate on what they experienced. We typically ask a range of demographics relating to gender, sexual, and racialized identity, age, disability status, contract status, the role of the participant, and location. Again, with location, we have to be pretty careful about that because of ensuring that we don't inadvertently reveal people's identity. So now, just focusing on the particular results from Manitoba teachers from the T1, the first wave that we gathered and closed in 2016. For this organization, we provided the survey both in English and in French. And for what I'm going to be telling you about now is the results for the English-based surveys with just over 3,000 usable cases, which is a pretty good size for Canada. We asked, and I'll be focusing right now on sharing results about rates of bullying exposure, and I'll say more about that in a minute, the various demographics, the mental health component, and people's awareness of policy and whether they've had training relating to violence prevention and harassment. As I think most people likely know, but I'll say that all school divisions in the province of Manitoba are mandated to have a violence prevention policy and a harassment policy, which includes behaviors and practices that are consistent with workplace bullying, as well as training components for those policies. So These results that I'm going to share with you are kind of broad brush, again, until we get these out into the scientific community. So I'll be speaking more really regarding kind of trends and broad brush here. These results here that you see reflect that self-identification method I described earlier. So we provided this standard definition and asked, according to this definition, in the past 6 months, do you believe that you have been bullied by that definition? So we see just over 25%, 20%, 25% said, yes, I have been. And then we looked more carefully at who was doing that, who were the sources. And we found that kind of equally, these came from those above them in the organizational hierarchy, co-workers, as well as parents and guardians, around 30% for those sources, and students were about 20%. For this organization, we asked generally by this definition also, did you observe bullying going on around you? And because this is in an educational setting, did you observe the S2 here referring to student? So this is, of course, of great concern. Currently, the safety of the learning environment, both for students and for staff and members of the educational profession. So we did ask this question, and we also asked, did you exhibit these behaviors yourself? And we got just over 5-ish or so % of people said, yes, actually, I do that. I did do this. I have been doing this myself over the past 6 months. Val was interested in me providing some information regarding kind of overall types of bullying, including cyber. So Val, these are the collected rates of people's self-reports of the nature of bullying across the 5 province-wide data sets. So we asked people to say whether the bullying that they experienced, if they said yes, they were then streamlined over to these questions regarding the type of bullying. These were not mutually exclusive, so people could choose all that apply. Clearly, the predominant form of bullying that people experienced was verbal. A good portion was social exclusion, people feeling intentionally left out of social activities in the workplace. Cyber, whether that's through email, whether that's through Facebook or other social media platforms, was kind of number 3 there in the hit parade. Physical violence, a close 4th. Something we call emotional, kind of linked to emotional abuse, coming in 5th, and sexual coming in last at just over 2%. We found, again, aligning now with some UK results that I spoke to earlier, but again, not having a lot of North America evidence yet to show this because the data sets have not been large enough, that females, people who are older, people who are disabled, and people who are LGBTQ, pardon me, we did ask for people if they identified as trans, and we didn't have any, so we removed the T from that description. Racialized identity was not related to being bullied. And I will just share this slide, these results here related to role. In this case, we looked at school leaders compared to non-leaders and their experiences of being bullied. And we found overall that leaders were not that different in the bullying rates that they experienced. But if we split it out by gender, and we're going to see this gender layering that comes into play in a little bit more detail later, female leaders were much more likely, significantly more likely than male leaders to say that they were bullied. And we found that the sources of school leaders' bullying, this surprised me, it did not surprise our educator partners, that the biggest source of bullying of school leaders were parents, and students were far lower by comparison. So we asked about disability, as I indicated earlier. We used a kind of standard HR definition that we provided relating to restriction of or lack of ability that results from impairment to perform activities. And again, by this definition, do you consider yourself to be disabled? And what we found were that those who said that they were, sorry, let me get my second one here. Those who said that they were disabled had far higher bullying rates, significantly higher than those who said they did not have a disability. And when we also split out, when we asked people, okay, if you said that you were disabled, is it a physical disability, is it a psychological, or do you have both? Those who had a psychological disability were significantly higher, said that they significantly had higher rates of bullying than those who were physical, had a physical disability of its nature. Then we looked at also in terms of who's most at risk, sexual identity and being bullied. And here's where we see a little bit again of that gender layering, with the highest rates of bullying, just over 30%, the blue column, female sexual minority members, lesbians, followed by female heterosexuals, with male sexual minorities and male heterosexuals being lower. So now, finishing off that section on, on the exposure, a quick word on mental health and how we measured that. And I'm going to speed up a little bit because there is a little bit more I want to get through. And again, more will be spoken to in a very broad brush kind of way. We used an established measure by Keyes, Corey Keyes, the mental health continuum, which is a really has a nice multidimensionality to it, looking at emotional, psychological, and social functioning. And Keyes provides a means of combining those in a kind of aggregated index called flourishing, which is really a high bar. You have to be kind of consistently, pretty much daily, experiencing healthy levels of mental health across those dimensions in order to be classified as flourishing. So this flourishing dimension is what I'm going to be referring to now. So looking now, layering over mental health and bullying exposure, with the blue columns saying, yes, I was bullied, no, I was not bullied, with the level of flourishing on our Y index. So what we see across all bullying exposures is that those who said, yes, they were exposed to bullying, had lower levels of flourishing. And these were significant differences within each category of exposure. So we found that to be a pretty striking finding. When we look now layering over with disability, very similarly, if people said, yes, I am a disabled person, and whether that was physically disabled or psychologically disabled, if I was bullied, the levels of flourishing are lower. But you see that they're very kind of surprisingly close in a way for physical disability, but a very big difference, again, for those who are psychologically disabled. Their flourishing levels are really constrained here. Okay, and then a final slide within this set here, looking at sexual identity. Again, kind of similar pattern. Those who are bullied, regardless of their sexual identity category membership, experience lower levels of bullying, and in some cases quite pronounced. So the third cluster there, the female sexual minority members, very big discrepancy, much lower mental health for lesbians particularly if you compare that to female heterosexuals and male heterosexuals. Okay, so the final sort of set of results we'll be speaking to again here now at a fairly broad brush level, where we now overlay with the knowledge of policy and training. So the simplest way to say it is that for those people who are aware of and trained on both those violence prevention and harassment policies, had consistently lower rates of bullying. And for those who had no experience of bullying whatsoever, it was highest when they were aware of and trained on at least one policy, and lowest when they were unaware and untrained on both policies. So there's a kind of buffering or protective effect that we saw here for that knowledge of the policies and the training. And when we add then the flourishing levels into that mix to overlay with policy awareness and training, again, this is sort of a lot to take in, but just look at the trend here, moving from left to right of increasing awareness, increasing levels of training. We see kind of slowly increasing levels of flourishing, but with that real split between whether you were bullied, this is just looking at the target perspective, or not bullied. So the mental health protective effects, if you will, of that knowledge of policy is pretty strongly demonstrated here. Pardon me, I'm getting a bit of a dry throat here. So as I move to close now, in looking at prevention, what our results tell us is, of course, policy, that's very important. Policy must be enforced in order to be effective. And there must be a training component. That training does need to move simply beyond avoiding legal liability. We know that training needs to happen across levels. We know that also the ability for people to receive complaints, whether that's at a middle management level or in dedicated resources, is really critical. People need to be able to know how to handle complaints or concerns about bullying and mistreatment, and it needs to be integrated from the top down. We know clearly from these results, and we're surprised that there were gaps in policy awareness and training when these policies and that training are mandated. Nevertheless, there are still gaps in policy and training. And so if we can address those gaps and apply best practices to ensure that there's a kind of continuous learning and continuous uptake, continuous application of those best practices, will go towards prevention, absolutely. There are some key insights for research. We need to move beyond descriptive research that simply talks about the what intervention and looking at longitudinal, looking at direct interventions, and looking at evaluations. We need to also research the training itself. We need to know what's effective, why is it effective? And we need to link that commitment to research in integrated cultures that value context-specific evidence from the leaders on down. We have some key questions that our group wishes to follow up with, and that is to look at those impact of policies and training, to do some intervention and evaluation, and identify what are those optimal methods for raising awareness. And my final slide here, just simply to let you know that we're going to be looking for funds here. We're looking for the right funding body to be able to help us take this further by looking at OHS-based interventions to pursue this work. We're looking at interest. There's some local interest in a center on partnered research practice on workplace bullying and mistreatment prevention. For these two bullets, I'm definitely interested in any ideas and any input that the audience may have on this too. So please feel free to follow up with me directly on that. And just to let you know, and I'm very happy that our institution, University of Winnipeg, has committed to embedding a course on psychological health in the workplace within our BBA program. This is available for the advanced students who are in the HROB concentration. We've run it 2 years now, and students are very much enjoying it and really liking, for me, those research teachings. I provided less extensive than Catherine's references. These are selected, but if there's any additional ones that people would like to follow up with, I'm happy to direct you to where those are. I will just also point out here, in the interest of making things available, that with the starred one, just towards the bottom, the Harlos and Axelrod, we do make those scales that are validated now in Canada. Scales for verbal abuse, work obstruction, and emotional neglect are available for free. If you just check out my website, they're right there. So that's it for me, Val, and hope that hasn't taken up too much time and leaves a couple of minutes for questions if there are any, or we can do that at the end.